My name is Nicola Tiffen. I head up Duncan Cotterill's immigration practice, and speaking with me today is the lovely Reve, who is our senior solicitor in our immigration team. He's coming in from Auckland, and I'm down here in Christchurch. We also have offices in Wellington, Nelson, and Queenstown. So we're able to help any of you pretty much anywhere in New Zealand. Just so you know, the session is being recorded today. And as I was saying before, at the end, we'll have a question and answer session, and please do honestly feel free to contact us afterwards. And any of the advice today is generalized advice, and it's recommended that you contact us for bespoke advice because every immigration situation honestly is different. Without further ado, I'll get cracking. So what we're going to talk about today is all of these work visa changes that have been happening over the last few months. It's actually been reasonably confusing, I think, for lots of employers because the wage rates have changed, whether you need to advertise a position has changed. So Reve's going to talk us through all of that. The other hot topic we're going to discuss today is partnership visas, and specifically bringing partners into the country from abroad, and partners of both New Zealanders and work visa holders, because there's several different options there, and it's a little bit what's very confusing, not to mention the MIQ problem as well. Then we're going to talk about residence visas, and including the new 2021 residence visa that was announced just this morning. We're then going to talk about wider border closure exemptions, particularly for critical workers. I'm also going to talk about the changes to the MIQ framework, and specifically the pilot program that's just opened as of yesterday. And then at the very end, we're going to look towards the future and talk about the new accreditation regime that's slated to come into effect midway through next year. So without further ado, I'll hand over to the lovely Reve.
Thank you, Nicola. So as Nicola mentioned, we're going to start off talking about work visa changes, and as is always the case with immigration, the goalposts do move, and 2021 has been no exception to that. So before I move on, though, I think it's important to understand the distinction between temporary work visas and residence class visas. These are two separate processes, but as is often the case, these are inextricably linked, and they have a bearing on whether migrant workers can often remain in the country for a longer period of time. So it's always important to keep that in the back of our minds when looking at these temporary work visa criteria and changes. So we're going to look at the essential skills work visas in the first instance. Many of you will be familiar with these applications. And we're going to take a look at the ones where specifically a labour market check is required. So from 19 July 2021, any applications that are assessed by Immigration New Zealand will be using the updated median wage rate of $27 an hour. That's an increase from $25.50. This also ties in with the announcement this morning where eligible work visa holders who will be earning $27 an hour but have not yet put forward an expression of interest in residence under the skilled migrant category will be able to potentially apply for residence from 1 March of next year. So it's important for the next 6-month period where there may be visas expiring for businesses to be across these details to make sure they can support essential skills work visa applications through to next year, to make sure that their migrant workers have a valid visa when it comes to potentially applying for residence if they're eligible. So just stepping back into the essential skills process specifically, the median wage rate is important because it dictates how long the visa is granted for, typically 3 years, when someone is earning $27 an hour or in excess of that figure. Where someone's earning less than the median wage, someone may be granted a visa for 2 years, but sometimes for a shorter period, depending on if a stand-down period applies. The median wage also determines whether the work visa applicant can support a work visa for his or her partner. Again, if the work visa holder is earning beneath the median wage, then they're usually ineligible to support a partnership work visa. And it also has a bearing on whether the employer has to use perhaps a skills match report to satisfy the labour market check requirements. So if the visa applicant's earning in excess of the median wage, then usually a skills match report is not required, but if they're earning less than that, then it's almost definitely will be. It's also important to note that for the purposes of any labour market checks, immigration officers will accept that no suitably qualified New Zealand citizens or resident visa holders are available where the occupation is included on the long-term skill shortage list, or the regional skill shortage list, or the construction and infrastructure skill shortage list. So there's also a new process which has been implemented for applicants to remain in their existing roles. Now, someone doesn't necessarily need to hold an essential skills work visa to be eligible for this. They could have a working holiday visa, for example, but they must be remaining in the same role. So this is useful in circumstances where you may have an applicant whose visa is expiring in the coming weeks or months. It's a bit more of a streamlined process in the sense that the applicant will not need to provide new police clearances or medical certificates if they've been provided to Immigration New Zealand with a previous visa application. Same can be said for the applicant's work experience and qualifications, so evidence of that's been provided to Immigration New Zealand previously, then they don't need to provide that same information again. And importantly, the employer will not have to carry out the labour market test in this situation, because Immigration New Zealand will be satisfied that those steps have been taken. So that's a little bit of support that has been given to employers during the last period of time. And so I think that's a real positive going forward, coupled with the changes that we've seen this morning in terms of resident visas. And important to note that online applications can be made for these essential skills work visa applications where the individuals staying in the same position for a period of time. They were just paper-based, but that's been all migrated across the online system. And in terms of the visa duration, if approved, this will be granted for a period of 24 months. So moving on to the next slide, variation of conditions applications. These are still fairly common in the current climate, where we have a number of individuals changing their employment, and these variation of conditions occur where you may have a business who has offered employment to someone else in the same location, say in Christchurch, for example, and they're going to be staying in the same role. So the position remains the same, the location remains the same, they're just moving to a new employer. From the point that we lodge these applications, they're usually taking around 4 to 5 weeks. Prior to, I think it was about a month ago, they were all paper-based, which was causing quite a few headaches, especially during lockdown, where we didn't have access to printers and scanners, and trying to make certified copies of documents was not so straightforward. So that's another tick in Immigration New Zealand's box. They've gone to the online application system, which is great. Once one of these applications is submitted, you can also put forward what's called a visa escalation request. And we've done this on a number of occasions on behalf of businesses to try and expedite the variation of conditions application. There's a designated mailbox that Immigration New Zealand monitors on a daily basis, and these requests are assessed, and usually an outcome is provided within 5 working days as to whether there are merits to escalate an application and have it allocated to an immigration officer, usually within 24 to 48 hours if the request is successful. You do have to make arguments around why the application should be expedited or put in front of other applications, and that's typically around reasons as to whether there's an urgency for that person to start in the position. Perhaps they're starting on a project in a few weeks' time, and the 4 to 5 weeks time frame is not going to be viable for the business or the individual. Or it could be that person is earning a high salary, and there can be arguments made around the aspects of remuneration which speaks to the skill level of the applicant to expedite the visa. So those are aspects we've been dealing with lately, and I'm sure we'll continue to do. So stepping on from that, and just a note there, it's also important when dealing with visa applications under the variation of conditions scheme is to take a look at the ANSCO code. So that's the Australian New Zealand Standard Classifications of Occupations, to make sure that the position that the person's going from in their existing or from their existing employer to the next are the same. Some people can get tripped up on that, but once again, would recommend people to reach out on a case-by-case basis to drill down on the specific aspects of the job description to make sure it aligns with the ANSCO code. And we've noted on the slide there the accreditation regime. So as it stands, employers, businesses, there's no way to actually apply for accreditation because there is not an online system that exists. Those applications ended 30 June, and Immigration New Zealand did have a plan in place where we thought around 1 November would be dealing with a slightly different system, but that's not the case. That got pushed out to the middle of next year. So what we do have, though, is the cutoff that still applies for individuals who are wanting to secure a work to resident visa and are employed by an accredited employer. There is a cutoff date of 31 October 2021, which was announced previously by Immigration New Zealand and has remained. And that's the same for long-term skills shortage lists, visa applications. So it's important for any employees who are thinking about getting an application in to do so in the next month, so that they can secure their work visas, which will potentially tie them over into perhaps next year, so that they can look at their options around residency if they haven't put in an application for residence already. So moving on to the next slide, talking about partnership applications. Now, the crux of a partnership application usually has two main elements: that the visa applicant and their supporting partner are living together at the time of the visa application. And coupled with that, the couple need to demonstrate that they can demonstrate that they are in a genuine and stable relationship. So there's sort of two elements there. And we often provide things like, in terms of evidence, tenancy agreements, home ownership documentation, bank statements, evidence of utility bills sent to the same address so that we can put forward the cohabitation requirements to Immigration New Zealand. In terms of the genuine and stable aspects of the application, it might be that we obtain letters from friends and family attesting to the public nature of their relationship. And there's other aspects we can pull together for the genuine and stable part of the criteria. Now, during the pandemic, of course, we've had a number of situations where when you pick up the newspaper each day, there's going to be people in all parts of the world who are trying to get back to New Zealand. And there's been some fairly sad and emotional stories among that. There's a special process that exists at the moment for those partners from visa waiver countries. Now, a visa waiver country in Immigration New Zealand's eyes is usually a country that's relatively low risk, in terms of travel and, the passport that person is granted for being a citizen of that country. So, for example, the United States is a visa waiver country. And so if we have someone from the United States who is the visa applicant and they're in a relationship with a New Zealand citizen might be in New Zealand at the moment, and the United States citizen is in the United States, so they are separate. They are obviously not living together at the time that they're anticipating to submit the application, but at a previous time they had lived together. We can look to put forward an application for those people. Immigration New Zealand have a process where you put forward an expression of interest in the first instance, and then after that, if successful and invited to apply for a visa from Immigration New Zealand, the evidence has to be provided by way of documentation and uploaded to the person's online application portal. So we've had some success around those applications, which is really great. If the visa applicant is not from a visa waiver country, the applicant must meet the requirements for partners, i.e. living together in a genuine and stable relationship. And in addition, one of the following requirements must be met. So either be traveling with that New Zealand citizen or residence class visa holders. So it's been circumstances where there's been a fetch and fly scenario where someone's had to leave New Zealand, go spend some time in an overseas location with their partner who's been stranded offshore, and then travelled with them back to New Zealand. If that's not something they're going to do, then the visa applicant must be ordinarily resident in New Zealand or have a visa based on the relationship with their supporting partner already. So moving on to the fourth slide. So these partnership visa applications are specifically for migrants and their partners. So we're not talking about people who are New Zealand citizens or residents supporting applications here. So the first criteria, or the first process we'll look at is partners of critical workers. So there exists a pathway for these applicants. This is provided the supporting partner, so the critical worker who is living and working in New Zealand. This person must be earning a high salary amount. The figure is 106,080 based on a 40-hour work week. So Immigration New Zealand, when assessing these applications, will look to see that the person, they calculate it on an hourly rate. So if the person's paid a salary, then they'll pro rata it back, work it out depending on how many hours they're contracted to work. The critical worker in this application, you must also demonstrate that they have unique experience and specialist and technical skills that are not readily obtainable in New Zealand. This is, from our experience, a fairly difficult application to make, and by no means will be approved at the first blush. It can be achieved if the right guidance is provided, but there's a lot of evidence and submissions that have to be put forward to make sure that the unique experience and specialist aspects can be ticked off. And then also the second aspect is the not readily obtainable factor that immigration will have to consider to decide whether that skill set is just simply not something the employer can obtain from the local labour market. And so the other category there that's mentioned on the slide is partners of other types of workers. For this to be successful, the person must have had a partnership visa on the 19th of March and be stuck in an offshore location. And there's also other criteria specifically to that, but again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. It's sort of on a case-by-case basis that we'd assess something, and by all means happy to consider those scenarios. Or the other situation is where someone is the partner of a critical health worker. Now, critical health workers, there's a list of those that are stated on immigration's website. Again, not going to go into huge amounts of detail there, but it's fairly wide-ranging and does cover a lot of occupations. And just a note there again, the living together in a genuine and stable relationship, we still have to provide evidence around that. So moving on to the process, just to step you through how that works. So as I mentioned earlier, there's an expression of interest that has to be made. We can make that on behalf of people. If Immigration New Zealand are satisfied with the initial information in that expression of interest, they will provide an invitation to apply. At this point, this is when the visa applications can be made. So when offshore, it's called a critical purpose visa application. If successful, we have partners to complete a COVID-19 test prior to departure. And of course, the person will have to secure an MIQ spot, which is rather challenging in the current climate. And then once in New Zealand, if all of that is successful, we typically secure a longer term work visa for them and any other family members so that they can remain in New Zealand for a longer period of time. So that's all I'm going to cover off in terms of the slides today. I'm going to hand over to Nicola, who's going to finish off the remainder of the presentation.
Thanks, Reve. So we've still got quite a lot to cover, so hopefully we're keeping you interested. So exemptions to the border closure. So Reve's been talking about exemptions to the border closure in terms of relationships and couples and partners. But I thought it would be worthwhile talking about the other ways that people can come into the country. Now, the most common one, or one of the more common ones, is the critical health worker. So there's, as Reve was saying just before, there's a list of who is considered to be a critical health worker. But in essence, it's people like your doctors, your nurses, your aged caregivers, and people who are providing the support services to make New Zealand's health services work, such as the radiography technicians, the people who are coming in to look at the machinery and fix the machinery, which there's been a few urgent people coming in to do that, I'm aware of, in the last few months. So it's a defined set of employers, so your district health boards, your hospices, your aged care providers, and also your private healthcare providers such as your GP clinics, etc. I'm going to talk about the process for what's involved with bringing them in just once I finish talking about the other critical workers. So other critical workers is people that, the way I like to explain it is that there's somebody for whom the benefit of having them come into New Zealand outweighs the risk of having them come into New Zealand. And the policy setting is that you have to demonstrate that that critical worker has unique experience and specialist and technical skills that are not ordinarily found in New Zealand. Now, you'll remember that phrase from what Reve was saying just before, because that's the same criteria that is applied for bringing the partner in as well as a partner of another critical worker. So what does unique experience and specialist and technical skills not ordinarily found in New Zealand mean? So with unique experience and specialist and technical skills, you're talking about experience that's been gained by working globally or working in a highly specialist technical firm, or having education through a highly technical institution. And not ordinarily found in New Zealand essentially means the employer has got to demonstrate that there's no such workers in New Zealand, or if there are, there's not many of them, and they're certainly not available to the employer in New Zealand. So the individual has to be earning more than $106,080 per annum if you want them to be able to stay for more than 12 months. And you'll remember that Reve said before that that's based on a 40-hour week. So that means that the employment agreement must be quite clear that if the individual is going to work more than 40 hours a week and the salary is quite close to 112,080 per annum, that their hours are capped, or they're going to get paid more for every hour they work over 40 hours. Now you'll see that I've got in there the figure of 112,320. And the reason I've mentioned that is because there has been a reasonable amount of confusion about these two figures. And the 112,320, which I'm going to refer to again later, is the level that's set for somebody who's applying for residence to get their under the skilled migrant category, to get their application given priority. So a lot of employees think that they need to have the 112,320 both to bring their partner in and to get their residence application through the system. But really, to bring their partner in is only 106,080, but to get their residence hurried along, it's the 112,320. There's also another type of critical worker, and there's a list of them on the Immigration New Zealand website, and there's limited numbers of them. So that's what you would have heard about with the agricultural mobile plant operators or the shearers and people like that have been allowed to come in, the deep water fishing crew, and certain numbers of them have been allowed to come into the country, but they've limited the numbers in order to limit the risk. So as I was saying just before, the whole system, from my point of view, seems to be set up to try and make sure that the risk of bringing somebody in is outweighed by the benefit of having them in the country. So the border exemption process for one of these critical workers is that the employer submits the expression of interest. And that has got to include, you should be providing the employment agreement so you can show what level the individual is earning at. You've got to provide evidence of the specialist and the unique experience and the specialist and technical skills, and also evidence that those skills aren't ordinarily available in New Zealand. It does take a lot of work, and it's sort of belies how the form is online. It's an online form, and you can just rush through it, but really you do need to take your time about it and make sure you're uploading sufficient evidence to meet those criteria. If it's successful, the employee will be issued with an invitation to apply, and then he or she can apply for the critical purpose visitor visa. And that's normally processed fairly quickly, normally within 2 or 3 weeks. And then once that, and they can include all their family in that visa application. And they actually end up with just one piece of paper, one visa for everybody. And then they can get their COVID-19 test, hop on a plane to New Zealand, which there aren't so many of these days, and then hop into MIQ, which the employer is responsible for paying. One thing we would recommend, and we do recommend, is that the employee applies for a longer-term work visa as soon as they get into New Zealand. They can't apply for it until they get into New Zealand, but as soon as they can, and we've certainly submitted the applications whilst people are in MIQ, because somebody with a 12-month visa isn't eligible for access to publicly funded healthcare in New Zealand. So if your employee is travelling with children, I think it's really important that they're able to get healthcare if they need it. So try and get that long-term visa application in as quickly as possible. And you'll certainly, as Reve was just saying before, it's certainly a lot easier to get people visas these days if they're being paid over the $27 per hour. So the other thing to bear in mind if you're bringing people in from abroad is the high-risk country aspect. And this was sort of dropped out of the news a little bit. But if the employees are coming from Brazil, Fiji, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, or Papua New Guinea, they can't come into New Zealand until they spend at least 14 days in another country. What I've observed is a lot of people are spending that time in the UAE before they fly into New Zealand. But New Zealand citizens and their families can travel directly from those countries. Now, the reason I mention this is that it may be relevant in terms of the new MIQ process that's coming along. Now, we're getting on to residence visas. So where are we as of today is we have the skilled migrant category. So that was suspended during the lockdown last year. So by suspension, I mean that people could submit an expression of interest. So they could say, look, I'm interested in becoming a resident under the Skilled Migrant Program. They would complete an online form, demonstrate that demonstrate that they meet the criteria, and the form would go into a pool. And when the scheme reopens, Immigration New Zealand are going to issue invitations to apply, and then they can formally apply for the residence. So nobody has been selected from the pool since April, May last year. So that means that there's over 11,000 of these EOIs in the pool, and that will cover many of them will cover more than one person. And people who were able to get their formal application in before the suspension of the scheme, their applications are taking around 2 years to process. But as I was saying before, if an individual is earning $112,320 per annum based on a 40-hour week, or they require professional registration to do their job, then they can have their application prioritised, and that's normally processed within 3 or 4 months. If an employee's work visa is going to expire and the residence application is still sitting in a queue, the employee has the option to apply for a further extension to their work visa, or they can use the rules that Reve was just talking about before and apply for a 3-year extension. So either 12 months under one option or 3 years under the other option. Most people are choosing a 3-year option. The other one way of going towards residence is the work to residence scheme. Now that's where you're working for an employer who is accredited under the old accreditation regime. I'm going to talk about the new accreditation regime in a little bit. But those individuals need to have held a work to residence visa for at least 2 years and met all the criteria. So if they apply for their work to residence visa before the 7th of October 2019, they only need to be earning $55,000 per annum or $26.50 per hour. And that's increased to $79,560 per annum based on a 40-hour week. So they've either, depending on when they apply, they've got to be earning that amount throughout the 2 years. They, unfortunately, when they apply, it's at least 2 years again, just like with the skilled migrant category applications to be processed. That is unless they can be prioritised, which again is if they're earning more than $112,320 or they require professional registration, such as your doctors or your electricians. But there is the ability, if the residence visa application isn't processed before their visa expires, they can apply for a further work visa, which can be for up to 2 years. And it's really important that they apply for a further work to residence visa, not an essential skills work visa. And the reason I say that is because when they come to have the residence visa approved, they need to still be on a work to residence scheme. The next year, we're going to have a sort of variation of this type of visa, and I'll talk about that in a little while. But at the moment, as Reve was saying before, if you've got any employees who want to get on the work to residence scheme, they need to apply for that before the 31st of October. And that is assuming that your business is an accredited employer. If it's not, then unfortunately your business can't apply for accreditation at this point. So we'll have to wait for the new type of residence visa, which I'm about to talk about. So this was announced this morning at around 5 a.m. And I've tried to break it down into timeframes because I think it's the timeframe that's going to be the crucial part of it. And Reve and I were just talking about this before, and we think really maybe it should be called the 2022 residence visa, because I think most people aren't going to be able to apply for it, or lots of people won't be able to apply for it until March next year. So there's 3 sets of applicants that are relevant to timing. There's ones who have already applied for residence or have an EOI pending. That includes a child that was 17 or older on the 29th of September 2021, which is yesterday. Those who have not yet applied, who haven't submitted an EOI or haven't put in a residence visa application, and those who are not yet in New Zealand but are looking to come over here as critical workers. So on the 1st of December, those who have already applied for residence can apply for the new type of residence visa. And that will be people who have already submitted their skilled migrant category residence application. That's probably languishing in that queue that I was just talking about. Or they've got an EOI sitting in that pool, and they've got a child that's age 17 or over. Those people will be able to apply anytime from the 1st of December 2021 and for the 31st of July next year. On that date, no more applications will be accepted. And everybody else will be able to apply from the 1st of March next year through to the 31st of July. So we've got a pretty narrow time frame there in which to get those applications in. And that, interestingly, will include critical health workers. So those are the people who have come in and with critical health worker visas, as long as they arrive before the 31st of July and their critical purpose visitor visa is valid for 6 months or longer, or the other critical workers, which are the people I was talking to you about before, have got that unique and specialist and technical skills, who've got a critical purpose visitor visa that's valid for 6 months or more. What's an eligible visa to be able to, that you had to have had yesterday or applied for from yesterday? And that's a post-study visa. So all your lovely chaps and ladies who have come to New Zealand and studied, and after they've completed their qualification, have been given, in most cases, a 3-year visa. And you have to meet one of 3 other criteria. You must have either lived in New Zealand between the 29th of September 2018 and yesterday and spent at least 821 days inside New Zealand, which, given the level of lockdown and border closure we've had, probably isn't too tricky. And or you must be earning the median wage of $27 per hour as of yesterday. And Immigration New Zealand will look to Inland Revenue records to confirm that. Or be working in a job which is on one of the shortage lists or specific job lists. And I've just got the list here. There's a lot of jobs included in that list. I noticed that, for example, those who know me well, greenskeepers are in there, doctors, veterinarians, agricultural and horticultural plant operators, caregivers. So there's a lot of occupations that meet the criteria. So if they're not on the 27 and they weren't here on the 29th of September, it's still worthwhile just looking and seeing whether they qualify otherwise. In terms of, we haven't actually seen the law yet. It's called the instructions, and they haven't been published yet. They're often published on Fridays, so maybe they'll be published tomorrow. But the Minister has indicated that applicants may not need to provide a police certificate from overseas. So that would be particularly helpful if you're coming from a country where it can be a bit tricky to get a police certificate in a reasonable time frame. And also, you're unlikely to need to provide new medical certificates, but some people may need to provide a limited medical certificate. So a limited medical certificate is normally the one that people who are partners of New Zealand residents need to provide. So it's less medical tests and checks. They're just checking for fairly serious issues. So the one thing to remember about all of this is that no one can apply for this new type of visa until the 1st of December. We need to be seeing whether they've got a current application or an EOI submitted to see whether they're going to fall into the 1st of December bracket. Otherwise, we're looking to the 1st of March for people to apply. And we need to be checking what sort of visa they had as of yesterday and whether they fall into one of those 3 criteria. But on the whole, it's really good news, and it certainly will make it much easier for a lot of people to stay in New Zealand and stay in their jobs, which is the main thing people are wanting. So I just also wanted to talk about, because I do often get queries about our Australian friends. So we had this lovely travel bubble where they could hop over and see my little kangaroo. They can hop over and spend time in New Zealand. And it was particularly important for business. There's a lot of trans-Tasman business operations. And CEOs and CFOs needed to be able to travel back and forth. So did actually ordinary people. But they can't travel to New Zealand at the moment, even if they're happy to go into MIQ. That is unless they have a residence visa. So what we were doing prior to the bubble ending was we were varying the conditions of Australians' visas. So when they came to New Zealand, they got a residence visa that continued to run when they left the country. They can still get here if they don't have that, if they meet exceptional requirements, which is that they're ordinarily resident here, they're the partner of a New Zealander, they're a critical health worker, or they meet the other critical worker criteria, which I've talked about. They still need to go into MIQ, and that's really the big handbrake on things at the moment. So I'm just conscious of time. The government has signalled that it's wanting to reconnect New Zealand with the world, and it's hoping to slowly open the borders further up. It remains to be seen whether the borders will ever open up to the level that we're used to prior to COVID. And you may have all seen this slide that Jacinda Ardern held up to us a few weeks ago, just before the last lockdown. But you can see that there is a process in place, and we're pretty much in step 2 at the moment. We're just about to enter step 2 at the moment, because we're about to have the pilot scheme for business travellers to avoid having to go into MIQ. So I'll just quickly talk about that, because that's pretty much gone live yesterday in terms of being able to register for that. So it's a self-isolation pilot under the medium risk pathway, which is talked about in the previous slide, that table. It's only open to New Zealand businesses, so individuals can't apply. It's the business that has to apply, and it's only going to be for 150 employees. The business submits an expression of interest, and I understand it's reviewed by an evaluation panel. The expressions of interest are now open, and you can apply only for employees who are New Zealand citizens or residence class visa holders, so you won't be able to send your employees who are on temporary visas. They have to be making a short trip for business purposes only, and you have to show that that business purpose cannot be achieved by them staying in New Zealand. So in-person pitches is one, sales pitch, also fixing machinery and things like that. So you have to show that it's not possible to achieve what you need to achieve from within New Zealand. The employees have got to be fully vaccinated with the 2 Pfizer vaccines, that specify the Pfizer vaccine. They have to be willing to undergo a pre-COVID-19 test before they come back. And when they fly back in, they have to land directly on the international flight into Christchurch or Auckland. And the reason for that is because they don't want them being shipped around the country. So they fly into Christchurch or Auckland, and then they have to self-isolate within 50 kilometres of central Christchurch or Christchurch Airport or Auckland Airport, and within the Auckland boundary. You have to provide a self-isolation plan, and the employee can't isolate with their family. So that means they either have to have a separate house, or the employer has to rent a separate house for them to self-isolate at. That place cannot have any shared ventilation, so it couldn't be an apartment building, for example. It would have to be, a standalone house would be fine, and possibly townhouse. It would depend on how that's structured. It has to have mobile phone coverage, because obviously they're going to track your phone. There's a $1,000 MIQ fee, which I assume is because they're going to be checking on you. And you'll have to undergo the same checks that somebody would in managed isolation, which is a day 2 and day 9 test. And they have to be able to feed themselves, and the employer needs to be paying for that. So, and they can have food delivered by Uber Eats, etc. They just, they can't be going out into the community to go and fetch food. As I said before, the plan is to have a gradual opening of the borders next year, and it will be on a risk basis, so where they're coming from and what their vaccination status is. So if you think about before, I was talking about those high-risk countries, I suspect we won't be allowing people to come in from those countries for a good length of time without having to go through MIQ. And it will be difficult for people from countries where potentially we don't recognise their vaccine yet, whether they can come in to the country. Okay, so just a quick sort of catch up on what's going to happen next year. We're going to have this long-awaited compulsory accreditation regime. It's effectively a licensing regime. So remember earlier, Reve and I were talking about accreditation, being able to get work to residence visas through for your employees through accreditation. This is a different kettle of fish. This is basically an employer having to be licensed to support any migrants at all. If you've got 5 or less migrants, it's a reduced process, and it's almost like a registration scheme, I understand. And 6 or more migrants, there's going to be a higher level of requirement, such as evidence of commitment to improving pay and work conditions. At least 10% over the minimum wage is what you've got to pay. You've got to demonstrate that you're in a sound financial position. You've got to demonstrate that you've made efforts to minimise exploitation, and they'll require you, by the looks of it, to complete online employment rights modules on the MBI website, and also ensure that the migrants do so as well. So that's not coming in until midway through next year. At the moment, you can't apply. So what I'm sort of telling you is what's based on the policy statements at the moment. But just wanted to signal that that's coming. So what does this all mean? If you've currently got accreditation, you can't renew it, and if you don't have accreditation, you can't apply for it. You'll be able to apply for the new type of accreditation when that goes live midway through next year. If you've got employees, if you're an accredited employer and you've got employees who edging close to that magic $79,560 per annum, I think they should apply for a work to residence visa. Although it might be worthwhile having a chat with them to see whether they're going to fall in under the new residence regime that's coming into effect for them on the 1st of March. The essential skills work visas, they're going to continue through until midway through next year when the new regime comes into effect under the compulsory accreditation. Bear in mind what Reve was saying about the $27 per hour to get individuals 3-year visas. If they had a work visa as of yesterday and were earning $27 per hour or on one of those occupations, then it would be very much worth a while looking at applying for residence next year. The long-term skill shortage list is going to stay in existence, but it will not lead to residence like it does now, but it will mean that employer is probably not going to need to demonstrate that they've tried to find New Zealanders for the position. And post-study work visas and specific purpose work visas are still going to be available. So the post-study work visas are the ones I mentioned before, where somebody's come to New Zealand to study, completed their degree, and they get a 3-year visa. And specific purpose work visas are under international law, where we have to facilitate international trade, and we allow people to come in for specific trade-related purposes, such as coming in ordinary times to fix machinery or be seconded into the New Zealand branch of a company. Also, under the new accreditation scheme, it looks as if an employee is earning $200,000 or more per annum, they will be able to qualify for residence after 2 years, similar to the current accreditation scheme. So that was pretty much a scamper through all of the changes in immigration over the last few months, and including this morning. Thank you very much for coming and listening to us. I hope it was helpful, and I hope to see you at the next webinar. Right, take care.